There is a 40-second stretch in Season 3 of Rick and Morty where the smartest being in the universe sits under a machine he built to kill himself, passes out drunk before it fires, and wakes up alone on a garage floor while the rest of his family sleeps upstairs. No one checks on him. No one knows it happened. The show moves on the next morning like nothing did. That scene is the entire show in miniature, and almost nobody talks about what it actually means. Rick Sanchez has been telling everyone around him exactly who he is since the first episode. The pain, the grief, the walls, the love he cannot say directly, all of it is there, in plain sight if you know what you are looking at. Today we are going to look at it, all of it. Welcome to Ricktopus. If long-form analysis like this is what you are here for, subscribing is free and it helps more than you know. Let us get into it. The totally fabricated origin story that wasn't. There is a moment in Season 3 of Rick and Morty where Rick, sitting inside a simulation built by the Galactic Federation to extract the secret of interdimensional travel from his brain, shows his captors a memory. In that memory, a younger Rick is working in his garage. A stranger appears, another Rick from a different dimension, and offers him a portal gun and the keys to the infinite multiverse. Young Rick turns him down. He looks through the window at his wife Diane and his little daughter Beth playing in the yard, and he says no. He doesn't want it. He has everything he needs right there. The stranger leaves. A device drops from the sky and destroys the house. Diane and Beth die in the explosion. Young Rick, who couldn't stop it, who watched it happen from inside his car, is left with nothing. The grief breaks him open. It's the reason he built the portal gun. It's the reason he left. It's the reason he is the way he is. Then Rick turns to his captors and says it was a totally fabricated origin story. And the show moved on. For 2 full seasons after that, Rick and Morty kept the question open. Was the memory real? Was any of it true? Was Diane a real person? Was there ever a Beth who died? The show teased the question, dropped hints, and then deliberately avoided answering. When Mr. Nimbus, Rick's ancient rival and the king of the ocean, showed up in Season 5 and casually mentioned Diane by name, Rick's response was immediate and furious. He told Mr. Nimbus not to establish canonical backstory. He said it like a joke. He broke the fourth wall just enough to make the whole thing feel like the show was winking at the audience. It was funny. It was also the show telling you exactly what Rick does with anything that hurts him. He frames it as a joke. He calls it fake. He refuses to let it be real in front of anyone who might use it against him. Then Season 5 ended, and everything changed. The episode Rick Mirai Jack confirmed it. Not all of it, not in perfect detail, but enough. The memory Rick showed the Galactic Federation was not totally fabricated. It was, as the show put it, mostly accurate. Another Rick, the one the show would come to call Rick Prime, showed up and offered C-137 the technology to travel between dimensions. C-137 said no because he wanted to stay home. He had a wife. He had a daughter. He had a life he didn't want to leave. Rick Prime, furious at being turned down, came back and dropped a device on the house. Diane and young Beth died. Rick C-137, the Rick the audience has followed across 7 seasons of television, watched his family get murdered because another version of himself couldn't handle being told no. That is the real origin of Rick Sanchez. Not a scientist who one day decided nothing mattered, not a genius who got bored of normal life, a father and a husband who lost everything in an afternoon because of a choice he made. The right choice, the human choice, the choice to stay, and who spent the next several decades of his life trying to find the man who took that choice away from him. This changes how the entire show reads, and the writers knew it. They kept it hidden for 5 seasons on purpose. Rick's behavior across all of Season 1 and 2, the drinking, the cruelty, the casual destruction of people and places and relationships, looks different once you know what he's running from. His refusal to get close to anyone reads differently. His constant insistence that nothing matters reads differently. He's not a man who arrived at nihilism through philosophy. He's a man who had something real, lost it in the worst possible way, and built an entire personality around making sure nothing could ever hurt him that badly again. The drinking started as a response to grief. This is confirmed in the show. The Rick and Morty wiki and the episode Rick Mirai Jack both make clear that Rick became an alcoholic to cope with losing Diane. Before her death, he is shown as someone who turned down the infinite multiverse because he didn't want it without his family. After her death, he spent years hunting Rick Prime across dimensions, killing other versions of himself when he thought he'd found the right one. Unable to stop, unable to grieve properly, unable to do anything except keep moving. The alcohol was the only thing that slowed the noise down enough to function. And then there's the question of what the show was doing by hiding this for so long. Rick and Morty is a show that understands something true about people in pain. They don't announce it. They don't explain it. They dress it up in jokes and misdirection and fourth wall breaks and catchphrases. They say the memory is fabricated. They tell their captors characters a fake story so convincingly that they almost convince themselves. Rick showed the Galactic Federation a version of his real history wrapped in just enough performance that he could watch it happen without fully owning it. That is not the behavior of a man who doesn't care. That is the behavior of a man who cares so much that the only way he can touch the memory at all is through a layer of distance. The show let the audience do something similar. For 5 seasons, viewers who wanted to believe Rick was just a cool nihilist with no real backstory could believe that. The totally fabricated origin storyline gave everyone an exit. You didn't have to take Rick's pain seriously if the pain itself was made up. And plenty of people didn't. The Rick and Morty fandom in its early years produced a lot of content treating Rick as something to aspire to. The ultimate free agent, the smartest person in the room, unbothered by anything. The show watched this happen and, eventually, answered it. The memory was not fabricated. The grief was not fabricated. Rick didn't start as a cool nihilist. He started as a man who lost everything. There's a detail from Rick Mirai Jack that doesn't get talked about enough. After Diane and Beth died, the show confirmed that Rick spent decades, not days, not months, decades, hunting Rick Prime across the multiverse. He built his first portal gun himself, driven by the need to find the man responsible. He crossed dimensions. He killed other Ricks who he thought might be the one he was looking for. He eventually crossed paths with enough other Ricks that a small war broke out, which led to the founding of the Citadel of Ricks. All of that, the entire infrastructure of the multiverse as the show presents it, traces back to one afternoon in a garage where a bomb fell from the sky. Rick Prime, for his part, was aware of what he'd done. In the episode Unmortrican in Season 7, Prime revealed that after killing C-137's Diane, he did the same thing to Diane's in other dimensions. Other versions of Rick's wife in other realities killed one by one. He eventually used a weapon called the Omega device to kill every version of Diane across the entire multiverse at once. Every Diane in every reality is gone because of Rick Prime. The woman Rick C-137 lost is not just dead in his dimension, she's dead in all of them. There is no version of the multiverse where he could go to find her. The show built this in over multiple seasons to close every possible door. Rick cannot move to a dimension where Diane is alive. She isn't alive anywhere. This is also why the Diane AI that Rick built, the one living in his old house in dimension C-137, the one that calls to him from the other room, is both devastating and completely in character. Rick built a machine that sounds like his dead wife calling him home. He didn't build it to feel better. He built it to feel worse, because the guilt of not saving her needed somewhere to live, and an AI that reminds him of his failure every time he walks through the door is at least something. When he returned to C-137 in Season 6, he told the Diane AI it was time to move on. The AI pointed out that Rick Prime had also been reset by the portal fluid error, meaning the hunt could start again. Rick nearly went back to his old mission before Morty talked him out of it. He needed Morty to talk him out of it. The smartest being in the universe, the man who built a portal gun from scratch out of grief and rage, needed a 14-year-old to remind him that there was a reason to stay. That's who Rick Sanchez actually is, stripped of the catchphrases and the fourth wall breaks and the totally fabricated origin story. He is a man who made one good choice, the choice to stay home with his family instead of chasing the infinite multiverse, and had that choice taken from him by a version of himself who was worse. He has spent everything since then building walls. The nihilism is a wall. The drinking is a wall. The cruelty and the dismissiveness and the constant insistence that nothing matters, all walls. The fabricated origin story is a wall. He told the Galactic Federation a fake version of his own real history because the real version was too true to say out loud. And here's the thing about the memory he showed them. Even the fake version, even the one he called totally fabricated, had Diane in it. He couldn't build a lie that left her out. She shows up even in the stories he tells to keep her hidden. That's what 5 seasons of misdirection was pointing at. Not a cool nihilist, a man who loved his wife and couldn't save her and has been lying about it ever since. __quote _0 ___. But what Rick says about himself and what Rick actually is have always been two different things. His loudest claim, the one he makes almost every episode, the one that launched 1,000 college dorm room posters, is that nothing matters. Love is just a chemical reaction. Caring is weakness. He says it constantly. He says it with conviction. He almost never acts like it's true. And that gap between what Rick Sanchez tells you about himself and what Rick Sanchez actually does is where the real character lives, which is exactly what the next section is about. Section 2. Rick is not a nihilist. He's a cynic. Rick Sanchez has a speech he gives. He gives versions of it constantly, across every season, in different words but with the same basic shape. Nobody exists on purpose. Nobody belongs anywhere. Everybody is going to die. Love is just a chemical reaction that makes animals reproduce. The universe is indifferent. Nothing you do matters because the scale of existence makes every individual action meaningless. He says these things the way other people say good morning, casually, confidently, like a man who has thought about it very carefully and arrived at a conclusion he is no longer interested in debating. The problem is that Rick Sanchez does not live like a man who believes any of that. He saves Morty constantly. He surrendered himself to the Galactic Federation at the end of Season 2 so his family could go home safely. He spent decades hunting Rick Prime across the multiverse, not because it was logical, not because it served some larger purpose, but because of grief and love and the specific fury of a man who had something taken from him. He cried over Unity's goodbye letter. He built an AI version of his dead wife so he would have something that sounded like her. He told Morty in Season 5 that he had been a bad partner because he never made him a true partner, which is not a statement a man makes if he genuinely believes relationships are meaningless chemical reactions. The gap between what Rick says and what Rick does is not a writing mistake. It is the entire point of the character. And understanding that gap properly requires making a distinction the show itself never spells out in plain language, but that is visible in every episode if you know what to look for. Rick is not a nihilist. He is a cynic, and those two things are not the same. Nihilism, in the simple version, is the belief that nothing has meaning or value. A true nihilist doesn't care about anything because there is nothing to care about. Nothing matters, so nothing matters. The conclusion and the behavior match. If you genuinely believed that love was just a chemical reaction and that every life was equally meaningless in a vast and indifferent universe, you would not spend decades hunting the specific person who killed your wife. You would not cry in a garage. You would not build an AI that sounds like someone you lost. Those behaviors require caring. They require meaning. A real nihilist doesn't have them. Cynicism, in its original form, not the everyday use of the word, which just means being negative and sarcastic, but the actual philosophy that goes back to ancient Greece, is something different. The ancient cynics, the philosophers who started the whole tradition, believed that most of what society calls important is actually fake. Social rules, status, wealth, reputation, they thought these were traps. Ways of controlling people by making them chase things that don't actually matter while ignoring the things that do. The cynics responded to this by living in a way that deliberately rejected those traps. They refused to respect authority just because it called itself authority. They broke social rules on purpose to prove the rules were arbitrary. They were provocateurs. They were deliberately difficult. They were, by the standards of everyone around them, completely insufferable. They also cared enormously about truth, about what they thought actually mattered underneath the performance and the pretense and the social games. The cynicism was not indifference. It was a very loud, very aggressive form of caring that expressed itself through rejection of everything fake. Watch Rick with this frame, and the whole character shifts. Rick does not blow up bureaucratic systems because nothing matters. He blows them up because he has decided that most systems exist to benefit the people running them at the expense of everyone else, and he refuses to pretend otherwise. He does not disrespect authority figures because he is indifferent to the world. He disrespects them because he has looked at their authority and found it hollow, and he thinks pretending it isn't hollow is a form of dishonesty he cannot stomach. His relationship with the Galactic Federation, with the Council of Ricks, with every government and institution the show places in front of him, is not the relationship of a man who doesn't care. It is the relationship of a man who cares very specifically about one thing, whether something is real, and has concluded that most powerful institutions are not. The Council of Ricks is the clearest example. Rick C-137 is described in Season 1 as the malcontent, the rogue, the one Rick who refuses to cooperate with the rest. The Council represents something that should, on paper, appeal to a nihilist, a group of beings who have agreed that individual meaning is pointless and that collective survival is what matters. Rick hates them. He hates them specifically and personally. His contempt for the Council is not the flat indifference of someone who doesn't care about anything. It is the hot, active contempt of someone who has looked at what they are, a group of geniuses who decided the best use of their intelligence was to consolidate power and protect themselves, and found it genuinely offensive. A nihilist would shrug at the Council. Rick despises them. That distinction matters. There is an episode in Season 2 called Rick Potion Number 9, where Rick, at Morty's request, makes a love potion that goes wrong and eventually turns every human being on Earth, except for the Smith family, into grotesque mutations. Rick and Morty try to fix it. They make it worse. Eventually, Rick locates a parallel dimension where an alternate version of himself has solved the problem, but where that Rick and that Morty both died shortly after solving it. He takes Morty to that dimension, buries buries the bodies of their alternate selves in the backyard and tells Morty that this is now home. He says it flatly. He moves on. This is the moment most people point to as evidence of Rick's nihilism. He discarded an entire reality the way someone discards a broken phone and moved on to a new one. It looks like nothing matters. But watch what he does immediately after. He builds a functional life in the new dimension. He stays. He keeps coming back to the garage. He keeps taking Morty on adventures. He doesn't disappear into the infinite multiverse and leave everyone behind. He settles. He builds something. A true nihilist, confronted with infinite realities and the knowledge that any of them is as meaningless as any other, would have no reason to choose one and stay in it. Rick does. He chooses the one with his daughter in it, even if it isn't technically his daughter. Even if the Morty in the backyard isn't technically the original Morty. Even if none of it technically belongs to him. He chooses it and he stays. That is not nihilism. That is a man who needs connection so badly that he will fake his own death in a parallel dimension and take a dead man's life just to have a family to go home to. The drinking is another place where the nihilist label falls apart. Rick drinks constantly. This is established from the very first scene of the very first episode, where a visibly drunk Rick wakes Morty up in the middle of the night, bottle in hand, dragging him toward a portal gun and an adventure. His alcoholism is played as a character trait for most of the early seasons, almost like a quirk, part of the Rick Sanchez package. But alcoholism is not a nihilist behavior. Nihilism offers a kind of peace. If nothing matters, there's nothing to be in pain about. Alcoholism is what happens when something matters too much, and you need somewhere to put the pain of it. Rick drinks because he is in pain. The pain requires something to numb it. The numbing requires alcohol. A man with nothing to feel does not need a drink. Birdperson made this explicit in season 1. When Morty asks about Rick's catchphrase, the one that sounds like nonsense, the wubba lubba dub dub, Birdperson translates it. In his language, it means, "I am in great pain, please help me." Rick has been saying that in every episode, in every room, to every person since the beginning of the show. He buries the cry for help inside a sound that means nothing, so that anyone who hears it will laugh instead of respond. That is not the behavior of a nihilist. That is the behavior of someone who is desperate to be understood and terrified of being understood at the same time. The clearest evidence that Rick's worldview is performance rather than belief is the way it crumbles under specific pressure. Rick can maintain the nothing matters posture through almost anything. Alien invasions, government imprisonment, the death of people he barely knows. But put him in a room with Unity leaving, and the posture collapses. Put him in a room where Morty is genuinely in danger, and watch how fast the cool detachment evaporates. The posture is a coat he wears. It comes off when the temperature changes. Unity was a hive mind Rick used to date, a being capable of controlling the consciousness of an entire planet's population. When they reunited in season 2, and then Unity left again, sending Rick a goodbye letter explaining that she had to go because he brought out the worst in her, Rick did not respond with philosophical acceptance. He did not remind himself that nothing matters. He went to the garage and tried to kill himself. That is the response of a man for whom things matter enormously, who has no tools for dealing with loss except the bottle, and in that moment, the idea of simply not being there anymore. The show is honest about this. It doesn't frame the suicide attempt as out of character. It frames it as entirely in character, as the logical endpoint of a man who has built his entire existence around pretending not to care, who is suddenly confronted with proof that he cares more than he can handle. This is the cynic's trap. The cynic philosophers of ancient Greece were not indifferent people. They were people who cared so much about what was real and true that they couldn't tolerate anything fake. And they expressed that caring through a lifetime of aggressive rejection of everything they deemed dishonest. Rick operates the same way. His nihilism is the performance. The caring is what's real. He attacks meaning because meaning is dangerous. It means something can be taken from you, the way Diane was taken from him. Claiming nothing matters is the best protection he has found against ever being that exposed again.
But it doesn't actually protect him. It never does.
The grief leaks through in the AI he built that sounds like his wife. It leaks through in the decades he spent hunting Rick Prime instead of moving on. It leaks through in the way he chose this family, this dimension, this life, even when infinite alternatives were available to him. It leaks through in a catchphrase that, translated, is a plea for someone to notice that he is not okay. Rick Sanchez has spent a very long time building a very convincing case that he is the coldest, most detached, most unbothered being in the universe. The evidence against that case is every single thing he has ever done. He is not a nihilist. He is a man pretending to to be one, loudly and constantly, because the alternative, admitting that things matter, that people matter, that he matters, is something that feels impossible after everything he has been through. The cynic's armor is heavy. It is also the only thing between him and the version of himself that sat under a death ray in a garage and almost didn't survive the night. __quote_1___. What makes this armor genuinely interesting is where it came from. Not just from losing Diane, but from something Rick has been carrying even longer. Something that lives in a simple catchphrase that most people remember as a punchline. Because the first time Rick told anyone he was in great pain, no one heard it, and the show has been building on that silence ever since. Section 3, Wubba Lubba Dub Dub, is a cry for help. There is a scene in Season 1 where Morty asks Bird Person what Rick's catchphrase means. Bird Person, who has known Rick longer than almost anyone alive in the show, looks at Morty with complete seriousness and explains that in his native language, Wubba Lubba Dub Dub translates directly to, "I am in great pain, please help me." Morty laughs it off. The show moves on. Rick says the phrase again 2 scenes later, and everyone treats it exactly the way they always have, as nonsense. As Rick being Rick, as the sound a chaotic genius makes when he is having a good time. The laugh track equivalent of the show's universe responds to it the way it always responds to Rick, with a mixture of amusement and mild exhaustion. But Bird Person was not joking. He was not being poetic. He translated a phrase from his language into plain English, and the translation was a direct cry for help. Rick has been saying, in every room, to every person, across every adventure since the beginning of the series, "I am in great pain, please help me." And everyone around him has been hearing, "Classic Rick." This is one of the most important things the show ever does, and it does it so quietly that it is easy to miss entirely. Rick Sanchez has hidden his entire emotional reality inside a sound that means nothing to the people around him. He gets to say the truest thing about himself constantly, openly, in front of his family and his enemies and strangers on alien planets, and no one ever has to respond to it because no one knows what they are hearing. The cry for help is perfectly disguised as a catchphrase. It works so well that even Morty, who spends more time with Rick than anyone, heard the translation and moved on within seconds. Think about what that means for a moment. Rick is not hiding his pain. He is saying it out loud, repeatedly, in the same words for the entire run of the show. The hiding is in the language. He found a way to tell everyone exactly how he feels while guaranteeing that no one will ever take it seriously. Because the words sound like nonsense and the delivery sounds like celebration. It is the most Rick Sanchez solution to an emotional problem imaginable. Technically honest, completely hidden, and structured in a way that makes connection impossible while making it look like he is not even trying to connect. The catchphrase was actually created by accident. Justin Roiland, who co-created the show and originally voiced Rick, has explained that Wubba Lubba Dub Dub came from a moment where he stumbled over his lines during a recording session and improvised the sound. The show kept it. Then the writers made a decision. They built a translation into the canon of the show that turned a recording mistake into the most honest thing the character ever says. That decision tells you everything about what the writers understood Rick to be. Not a nihilist having fun with the meaninglessness of existence. A person in pain who has found a way to announce that pain while making absolutely sure no one can hold it against him. The catchphrase is not an isolated case. Once you start looking for the pattern, it shows up everywhere. Rick encodes his real emotional state inside things that give him room to deny it. He uses sarcasm to say things he means. He breaks the fourth wall to protect himself from sincerity. He frames genuine moments of care as jokes, hugs that turn into something dismissive at the last second, compliments that have an insult attached to them, so neither person has to sit with the warmth. His relationship with Morty for the first several seasons runs almost entirely on this mechanism. He cares about Morty enormously. Every major plot point across the show confirms this, but he almost never says it directly, and when he does, he immediately undercuts it with something cold or dismissive, as if the sincerity is a mistake he needs to correct before anyone notices. There is a moment in the season 1 finale, Ricksy Business, where Rick gets emotional while looking at a slideshow of photos showing Morty across his life. The scene is played quickly, almost as a throwaway, but Rick is visibly moved. He does not comment on it, he does not acknowledge it. The show just lets it happen and then moves on, the same way Morty moved on from the Wubba Lubba Dub Dub translation. These moments exist in the show as proof for the audience that the real Rick is visible just underneath the performance. The performance never fully closes. There are always small places where the actual person shows through, and the pattern across those moments is consistent. Rick feels things deeply, says so obliquely, and then immediately covers it. The alcohol fits into this pattern. Rick drinks in virtually every episode. He is drunk at the start of the very first episode of the series, stumbling into Morty's bedroom in the middle of the night, bottle in hand, rambling about the multiverse. His drinking is so constant that it becomes background noise, the same way the catchphrase becomes background noise. But alcohol, in the context of everything else the show reveals about Rick, is not a quirk or a character texture. It is the same mechanism as the catchphrase. It is a way of managing pain that looks from the outside like something else entirely, like the behavior of a man who is simply reckless and carefree and doesn't care about consequences. A man who is in great pain, who cannot say so directly, who drinks to slow the noise down enough to function, and who has wrapped that drinking in so much charisma and competence that the people around him never have to sit with what it actually is. Bird Person, who knew Rick before all of it, before Diane's death, before the decades of hunting Rick Prime, before the Citadel and the Portal Gun and the Smith family, is the only character in the show who consistently sees through the performance without being told what he is looking at. Their friendship, which began during Rick's time fighting the Galactic Federation as a young man, is built on a kind of understanding that the show mostly shows in small pieces. Bird Person translating the catchphrase is not a throwaway joke about Rick being secretly sad. It is the oldest friend Rick has, confirming, in front of Morty, that he has always known who Rick actually is underneath. The fact that Bird Person delivers this information calmly, without drama, suggests he has known for a very long time, and has simply accepted it as part of knowing Rick. The Tiny Rick episode in Season 2 takes this pattern and pushes it much further. Rick clones a younger version of himself and transfers his consciousness into the clone body, becoming a teenage version of himself to help deal with a vampire situation at Morty and Summer's school. Tiny Rick becomes immediately popular. He is charming and funny and energetic in the way only a teenager can be. But Rick's original consciousness, trapped in the young body, begins to fight back. It fights back through music. Tiny Rick starts improvising songs during a school talent show, and the lyrics, which he seems unable to control, are about being trapped and needing to get out. The subconscious breaks through the performance in the one way Rick has always allowed himself to be honest, obliquely, coded inside something that could be dismissed as a joke or a song or a catchphrase, so that he can say the true thing while retaining the option to deny he said it. Summer, importantly, is the one who figures it out. She notices that the song lyrics don't match Tiny Rick's cheerful surface. She realizes that the original Rick consciousness is trying to communicate through the music because it cannot communicate directly. This is the show spelling out its own pattern in clear terms. Rick communicates through indirect channels because direct channels are not available to him. The message is always there. It is always findable by anyone paying close enough attention, but it is wrapped in enough distance that Rick never has to be responsible for having said it. The most important version of this pattern, and the one the show returns to most heavily, is the way Rick talks about his family, particularly Beth. Rick's relationship with his daughter is one of the most complicated things in the show. He left when she was young. He came back decades later. He has never fully explained himself. He has never apologized in any way that didn't have an exit built into it. But in the Season 1 pilot, when he wants to distract Beth from being angry at him for keeping Morty out all night, he tells her, "You really made the crap out of those eggs." Beth's reaction is immediate and visible. She softens. She almost tears up. Not because it is a great compliment, because it is the closest Rick gets to saying he missed her, that she grew up and he wasn't there, and the fact that she has made a life and a family and a home is something he notices and is moved by. He wraps it in the language of scrambled eggs so that neither of them has to acknowledge what was actually said. Beth understood it. That is the terrible and specific sadness of the Rick and Beth relationship. She has spent her whole life learning to receive the things her father is unable to say directly. She has become fluent in his language of sideways honesty, the same way a person who grew up in a house with someone who couldn't say "I love you" learns to hear it in other things instead. The scrambled eggs comment is not a good thing. It is a sad thing dressed up as a sweet thing. A father who could say what he means directly would not need to hide a moment of tenderness inside a comment about breakfast. What the catchphrase and all of these other moments collectively reveal is that Rick's emotional world is not absent. It is enormous. He is not a man who has successfully detached from caring. He is a man who is overwhelmed by how much he cares, and who has spent decades building systems to keep that caring from being visible. The nihilism is one system. The sarcasm is another. The alcohol is another. The catchphrase that means "I am in great pain, please help me," delivered with the energy of someone having the time of their life, is the most complete version of the whole architecture. He gets to be honest. He gets to be hidden. Both things are true at the same time. And the design of the system is so good that it has worked for for years on the people closest to him. Morty heard the translation and laughed. Summer figured out the Tiny Rick songs, and even then had to push against Rick's resistance to get him to listen.
Beth has spent her entire life becoming an expert at decoding a man who refuses to be decoded.
None of them have been given a clean, direct version of how Rick feels. All of them have been given the coded version and left to do the work of translating it themselves. And here is the thing that makes this genuinely hard to sit with. Rick is not doing this to be cruel. He is not withholding himself from his family as a power move. He does it because direct honesty, for Rick, is the most dangerous thing in the world. The one time he allowed himself to be fully present with Diane, with the life they were building, with the choice to stay home instead of chasing the multiverse, it was destroyed in an afternoon. The lesson that his nervous system learned from that event is that being fully present and fully honest and fully connected makes you fragile in a way that can be exploited.
Not by someone who loves you, but by the universe, by chance, by another version of yourself who didn't like being told no.
Openness got Diane killed. The catchphrase is the solution Rick found to never be that open again. The tragedy is that the solution doesn't work. The pain is still there. It shows up in the translation of a nonsense sound. It shows up in songs a teenage clone can't stop himself from singing. It shows up in comments about scrambled eggs and slideshows of a grandson's life and a garage at the end of an episode where the most powerful being in the universe is alone and barely holding on. I am in great pain. Please help me. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. He's been saying it from the beginning. The question the show spends 7 seasons asking is whether anyone around him will ever fully hear it, and what happens when the pain gets loud enough that even his best systems can't muffle it, which is exactly what the next section is about, because there is one episode in the entire run of Rick and Morty where all the systems fail at once, in the same night, on the same garage floor, and the show lets the camera stay there long enough that there is no joke left to make. Section 4. The autoerotic assimilation scene and what it actually means. There is a garage. It is late. The lights are low. Rick Sanchez sits alone on a stool beneath a machine he has built, a crude, makeshift device pointed directly downward at where his head will be. On the floor next to him is an empty bottle. In front of him, moments earlier, was a small creature he had been keeping in his basement, a mutated thing he had been running experiments on, something he had caused to exist in a painful and wrong form. He had pulled it out, held it gently, and turned it to ash with the same machine now aimed at himself. Then he sat down under it, closed his eyes, and the device began to charge. He passed out before it fired. The song playing over this sequence is called Do You Feel It by a band called Chaos Chaos. It is quiet and spare, and it does not comment on what is happening the way a dramatic score would. It just plays underneath the scene while Rick's life almost ends on a concrete floor in a suburban garage, alone, after a night that started with him reconnecting with someone he used to love. This is the end of Autoerotic Assimilation. It is Season 2, Episode 3, and it is, by a significant distance, the most honest and most painful thing Rick and Morty has ever put on screen. To understand what the scene means, you have to understand the episode that leads up to it, because the suicide attempt does not come out of nowhere. It is the last step in a sequence the show has built carefully over 20 minutes, and every step matters. The episode begins with Rick, Morty, and Summer on a routine space trip that goes sideways when they board what appears to be an out-of-control spacecraft. Inside, they discover that the entire population of the ship has been absorbed into a hive mind, a single consciousness controlling many bodies at once. The hive mind speaks through one of the bodies, and Rick immediately recognizes it. This is Unity. Unity is a being that takes over the consciousness of individuals and entire populations, and Rick and Unity used to be together. They were, in whatever way applies to a hive mind and an old man with a portal gun, in love. The reunion is immediate and warm on both sides. Unity, now controlling an entire planet's worth of bodies, has access to essentially unlimited resources, and Rick throws himself into the reunion with an energy the show rarely gives him. He is happy, genuinely, visibly, unguarded happy, in a way that stands out sharply against the version of Rick the audience has been watching all season. He laughs. He is affectionate. He lets himself have fun in a way that doesn't seem designed to prove anything or protect anything. For a stretch of this episode, the Rick on screen is a version of the character that feels like what he might have been before everything went wrong. Morty and Summer, meanwhile, are having a completely different experience. Summer is horrified by the idea of a hive mind, seeing it as the complete removal of individual freedom and consciousness. She works to free some of the people Unity has absorbed and tries to build something resembling a normal society for them. Morty, who has been on enough adventures to take almost anything in stride, mostly goes along with the situation while trying to keep Summer from causing too much chaos. The subplot between them, Summer's idealism clashing with the messiness of actually freeing people, mirrors the main story in a way the show does not announce but clearly intends. Liberation is complicated. Wanting someone to be free and actually being able to free them are different things. Then, Unity leaves. The letter Unity writes to Rick before disappearing with the entire planet's population is one of the most important pieces of writing in the whole show. Unity explains that being around Rick is impossible, not because Rick is cruel or because the relationship is bad in any simple way, but because Rick's presence causes Unity to lose itself. Unity controls other beings, absorbs them, makes them part of a collective. Rick, without even trying, does something similar to the people around him. His gravity is so strong that everyone near him starts bending toward him, starts reflecting him, starts becoming a version of themselves that is shaped around what Rick needs rather than who they actually are. Unity recognizes that this is happening and that it makes them worse, that together they bring out the absolute worst in each other. Two beings who are both, in their different ways, in the business of making everything about themselves. The letter ends with Unity saying that Rick is somehow better at what Unity does without even trying. Unity physically controls people. Rick does it through personality, through intelligence, through the sheer force of being the most capable entity in any room he enters. The difference is that Unity knows it is doing it, and Rick, at least at this point in the show, either does not know or does not admit it. Rick comes home to find the planet empty and the letter waiting. He reads it. Then he goes inside, where Beth confronts him about the creature he has been keeping hidden in the basement, a mutated alien he had been using for experiments, which Beth and the family have now discovered. Beth tells him there can be no more alien pets. Rick, who has just lost Unity, who has just read a letter that accurately described the loneliness at the center of how he operates, who is standing in his daughter's house surrounded by a family he loves but cannot fully connect with, simply concedes. He does not argue, he does not deflect, he says, okay, and walks to the garage. What happens next is constructed in a way that is very specific and very deliberate. Rick does not dramatically announce what he is doing. He does not give a speech. He does not explain himself to the audience. He takes out the creature, holds it while it cries, and euthanizes it gently before sitting down under the machine. The gentleness with which he handles the creature is important. This is a man who is, in this moment, capable of care. Tender, quiet, careful care. For a thing that most people in his life don't even know exists. He is not numb. He is not detached. He is completely present, which is precisely the problem. The machine charges. Rick passes out. The machine fires into empty space above his unconscious body. He wakes up the next morning, alone on the garage floor, and the show cuts to the next scene. No one in the family acknowledges what happened. No one checks on him. No one comes to the garage. The morning after Rick Sanchez almost died on his own garage floor, the Smith family had breakfast and went about their day, and Rick woke up alone with an empty bottle and a machine that had almost done something irreversible. This is not an accident. The show is not forgetting to address the suicide attempt. It is making a specific and uncomfortable point about how Rick exists inside this family. His suffering is enormous, and it is entirely invisible to the people he lives with. Not because they are bad people or because they don't care about Rick, but because Rick has spent so long performing okayness that the people around him have no framework for recognizing when he is not okay. The catchphrase that means, "I am in great pain, please help me," has trained everyone around him to hear pain as entertainment. The garage is where he goes when the performance is over and there is no one watching. And because no one is watching, no one sees what happens there. The song choice is worth spending time on. Do You Feel It plays from the moment Rick begins to build the machine through the moment the device fires and Rick is slumped on the floor. The song is not triumphant. It is not dramatic in the way that a score designed to signal emotional importance usually is. It is small and quiet and a little uncertain, which is exactly right for what it is accompanying. The scene does not want the audience to feel the operatic, sweeping sadness of a big dramatic moment. It wants them to feel the specific, quiet, private sadness of a person alone in a garage making a decision that has nothing theatrical about it. Rick's lowest moment is not loud. It is the quietest thing in the episode, set against the enormous chaos of everything that came before it. Fans responded to this scene in a way that was notably different from how they responded to most things in the show. Reddit threads about autoerotic assimilation are full of people describing watching the garage sequence and going still. Descriptions of re-watching it multiple times. Descriptions of the scene hitting differently depending on where you are in your own life. One frequently quoted response describes the episode as the moment the show's alcoholism stopped being a punchline. That observation is accurate and important. For the first two seasons, Rick's drinking is a texture of the character. It is part of the Rick Sanchez aesthetic. The bottle is always
always there, always in hand, always associated with the chaos and the adventure and the portal gun. Autoerotic assimilation is the episode where the show forces the audience to look at what the drinking is actually for. Not for fun, not as a quirk, as a way of managing a level of pain that, when the management system fails even briefly, results in a man building a death machine and sitting under it. The creature Rick euthanizes before sitting under the machine is another layer that is easy to miss. Rick had been keeping this thing in his basement. It is described in the episode as something he had been running experiments on, a being that existed in pain because of things Rick had done to it. Rick killing it before attempting to kill himself is not random. He is tidying up. He is making sure the thing he had been responsible for doesn't have to keep suffering without him there to manage it. This is an act of care, strange, dark, and filtered through Rick's particular way of doing things, but care nonetheless. The man who is about to try to end his own life takes a moment to make sure something helpless doesn't have to keep hurting. It is the most human thing in the episode, and it arrives at the worst moment. The aftermath matters as much as the scene itself. Rick survives by accident. He passes out before the machine fires, because he is drunk, because his body gave out before his intention could follow through. He wakes up alone. He gets up. He presumably goes inside. The show does not give him a breakthrough, or a conversation, or a moment of being seen. He survives, and then life continues, and no one knows it happened. This is part of what makes the scene so difficult to dismiss as simply a dark joke or a dramatic moment for effect. The show does not rescue Rick with a meaningful conversation. It does not use the suicide attempt as a launching pad for a character arc that resolves in the same episode. Rick almost dies, no one notices, and the next episode begins as if it didn't happen. Because in the world of the show, for everyone except Rick, it didn't happen. This is also a precise and painful portrait of how suicidal depression often works in real life. Not as a dramatic event that gets noticed and addressed, but as something that happens in private, that is survived by accident or by small chance, that leaves no visible mark on the world around the person who went through it. Rick's family did not fail to help him because they don't love him. They failed to help him because they didn't know. Because he built systems to make sure they wouldn't know. Because wubba lubba dub dub means I am in great pain, please help me, and everyone hears it as a catchphrase. What the garage scene ultimately does is collapse every layer of distance Rick has built between his performance and his reality. For most of the show, there is always another joke available, another deflection, another way to reroute a conversation away from anything true. In the garage, alone, after Unity left and Beth said no more alien pets and the family went to bed, there is nothing left to deflect toward. The performance has no audience. The nihilism has no one to perform for. What is left when Rick Sanchez is alone and has stopped performing is a man sitting on a garage floor who loved someone who left, who is living with a daughter he abandoned, who is raising a grandson that technically isn't his, who is surrounded by a family he cannot reach and cannot stop reaching for, in a life that is simultaneously more than anyone else has, and not enough to fill the specific shape of what he lost. The machine fires into empty space. Rick sleeps on the floor. The song ends. The show never fully returns to this moment in the way a traditional drama would. It does not get referenced in therapy. Rick does not bring it up. The audience is simply expected to carry it forward, to keep watching Rick crack jokes and build weapons and say nothing matters, and to remember what they saw in the garage. To hear Wubba Lubba Dub Dub differently after knowing what it means. To understand that the performance is a performance, and that underneath it is a man who almost didn't make it through a Tuesday night in his own garage. Quote 3 __. But the garage scene raises a question that the show will spend several more seasons slowly answering. If Rick's pain is this visible when the performance falls away, why does he work so hard to keep the performance running? What is he so afraid of that being known feels more dangerous than being alone on that floor? The answer turns out to be bigger than just Rick. It is written into the structure of the entire multiverse, built into a machine that runs on Rick's need to always be the most powerful person in the room, which is exactly what the next section is about. Section 5, the central finite curve as Rick's psychology made physical. In the season 5 finale of Rick and Morty, Evil Morty gives a speech. He has been building toward this speech for the entire episode, and arguably for the entire series, and when it finally comes, it is one of the most clarifying moments the show has ever produced. He describes something called the central finite curve. He explains what it is in plain, simple terms. He calls it a wall around infinity, a separation of all the infinite universes from all the infinite universes where Rick is the smartest being alive. He describes Rick as an infinite baby living in an infinite crib built by people who needed him to always be on top. And then he destroys it and leaves through a yellow portal into a part of the multiverse where Rick's dominance means nothing. The central finite curve is
is the most important piece of world building in Rick and Morty. It is also, once you understand what it actually is and where it came from, the most complete portrait of Rick Sanchez's psychology that the show ever produces. Because the central finite curve is not just a structural fact about how the multiverse works in the show. It is Rick's emotional damage given a physical form. It is what a man does with unlimited intelligence and unlimited grief when he cannot deal with either one directly. Here is what the curve actually is, in simple terms. The multiverse in Rick and Morty is infinite. There are infinite dimensions, infinite versions of every possible reality, infinite versions of every person who has ever existed. In most of those infinite dimensions, Rick Sanchez exists in some form, but in some of them, he doesn't. In some of them, he is not the smartest being alive. In some of them, someone else is smarter, more capable, more powerful. The standard portal gun technology that Rick uses throughout the show, the green portals, only travels within a specific section of the multiverse. That section is the central finite curve. It contains only the dimensions where Rick is the most intelligent being alive. Every time Rick steps through a green portal, he is guaranteed to arrive somewhere where he is on top. He has never, using standard portal technology, accidentally stumbled into a reality where someone outranks him. That is not a coincidence. It is by design. The curve was built by Rick C137 and a group of other Ricks working together in the early period after they all gained portal technology. The confirmed canon version of its origin, established across Season 5 and Season 6, is that C137 was the driving force behind its creation. He helped design the machine underneath the citadel of Ricks that enforces the curve, that locks out travel to or from any dimension where Rick is not dominant. The Ricks who followed him were happy to cooperate because the curve served their interests too. It guaranteed that every version of them would always be the most powerful being in whatever reality they entered. But C137 was the architect. This was his idea, or at least the idea he shaped and built and made real. The official reason the show gives for why C137 built the curve is that he was trying to trap Rick Prime. After Diane and Beth were murdered, C137 built his first portal gun and began hunting Prime across the multiverse. The curve, in this reading, was a way of narrowing the search, a way of walling off the specific section of the multiverse where Rick Prime was most likely to be hiding, making it harder for Prime to escape into the broader, infinite multiverse beyond. This is a real part of the explanation, and it is confirmed in the show, but it is not the whole explanation, because the curve does something else, something that has nothing to do with hunting Rick Prime, and that something else is where the psychology lives. The curve guarantees that Rick is never surprised. It guarantees that he is never outmatched. It guarantees that no matter where he goes, no matter how badly an adventure goes, no matter what mistakes he makes or what damage he causes, he remains the most capable being in the room. He can be wrong about tactics. He can miscalculate. He can blow up a planet by accident or create a problem that takes 3 episodes to resolve, but he cannot be fundamentally outclassed. He cannot enter a reality where someone else holds the position he holds. The green portal technology makes this structurally impossible. He built a machine to make certain that the one thing that would make him feel small, genuine inferiority, genuine powerlessness, the experience of being someone other than the smartest person in the universe, could never happen to him by accident. Now think about who built this. The man who built the central finite curve is the same man who, in his own original dimension, was not the most powerful being in the room. He was a husband and a father working in a garage when another Rick showed up with a portal gun. He was someone who got an offer he turned down. He was someone who, because he turned that offer down, watched his family die and could not stop it. He was someone who was, in that moment, completely powerless. The most important moment of his life, the worst thing that ever happened to him, was a moment of total helplessness in the face of someone with more capability than him. Rick Prime had portal technology that C137 didn't have yet. Rick Prime could travel between dimensions. Rick Prime could drop a bomb on a house and be gone before anyone could respond. C137 couldn't do anything except watch. The central finite curve is C137's answer to that moment. It is a machine that makes certain he is never that powerless again. Not just personally, structurally. He didn't just get stronger. He didn't just build a portal gun and become more capable. He restructured the accessible multiverse so that the condition of him being the most powerful being alive is baked into every dimension he can reach. He made his dominance into a physical law of the universe he travels through. The man who was helpless on the worst day of his life spent decades building an infinite walled garden where helplessness is architecturally impossible. This is Rick's psychology made physical. His need for control, his terror of vulnerability, his
inability to tolerate the possibility of being outranked. All of it is not just a personality trait. It is literally written into the structure of reality as he experiences it. Every green portal is a reminder that he never has to feel what he felt in that garage when the bomb fell. Every dimension he visits is pre-selected to guarantee his position. The whole multiverse, as far as Rick can reach, is arranged around his need to never be helpless again.
Evil Morty understands this better than anyone. His speech in the Season 5 finale is not just an explanation of the curve, it is a diagnosis of Rick. He describes every version of every Morty as having spent every version of every life inside a crib built around an infinite baby. He is not being metaphorical. The Mortys of the central finite curve genuinely do not know that there is a multiverse beyond the one they can access. They have been living inside Rick's emotional damage without knowing it was emotional damage. They thought the universe they could see was the whole universe. It wasn't. It was the portion of the universe that Rick needed to exist in for reasons that have nothing to do with them. The Ricks of the Citadel took the curve further than C-137 originally intended. They used it to create a permanent system of control. They engineered it so that Beth and Jerry, across countless dimensions, would always meet and always have children. Specifically so that Mortys would keep being born in large numbers. Mortys are useful to Ricks because Morty's specific brainwave pattern cancels out Ricks, making it harder for enemies to track them. The Citadel turned this practical fact into a factory. They manufactured the conditions for Morty's existence across infinite dimensions, harvested the Mortys that resulted, and treated them as a resource rather than as people. The central finite curve that began as Rick's grief response became the structural foundation for a system of exploitation that ran across the entire accessible multiverse. C-137 eventually abandoned the Citadel. The show confirms this. He helped build it, shaped its early development, and then walked away when the direction it was taking disgusted him. He cast himself back into the multiverse, drifting, until he found a dimension where a living version of Beth existed. Not his Beth, but a Beth who had been abandoned by her own Rick Prime, decades earlier. He moved into her garage. He became her father, or as close to it as he could manage. He found the Morty of that dimension and started taking him on adventures. This is the arrangement the show begins with. Rick C-137 living with a family that is not technically his, in a dimension that was not originally his, playing a role in a life he constructed out of the pieces of the one that was taken from him. There is a fan theory, based on information consistent with the show's canon, that C-137's motivation for building the curve was not entirely selfish. The theory holds that he built it partly to protect the Ricks who had not been through what he had been through, the versions of Rick who still had their Dianes, who were still living ordinary lives, who had never gained portal technology and never gone looking for it. By walling off the portion of the multiverse containing all the hyper-intelligent Ricks, C-137 may have been keeping the dangerous Ricks away from the peaceful ones. A Rick who never lost his family and never became what C-137 became might be safer inside the curve than outside it, because outside the curve there is no structure, no walls, no guarantee of anything. This theory is never confirmed in the show, but it is consistent with what we know about C-137's character, that underneath the control and the self-interest there is a layer of protectiveness that occasionally shows through. What is confirmed is that the curve's existence changed everything about how the show's universe operates, in ways the audience was not aware of for 5 full seasons. Every adventure Rick and Morty went on during those 5 seasons took place inside a walled garden. Every alien civilization they encountered, every planet they visited, every enemy they fought existed within a pre-selected section of reality. The version of the multiverse the audience was shown was not the whole multiverse. It was the portion Rick needed to exist in. The show was, in a very specific sense, showing the audience Rick's emotional damage from the inside without telling them that's what they were looking at. The yellow portal Evil Morty uses to escape is the visual confirmation of all of this. Rick's portals are green. Every portal the audience has seen for 5 seasons has been green. Green means inside the curve. Green means Rick is the smartest being alive at the destination. Evil Morty's yellow portal goes somewhere green portals cannot go. It goes to the actual multiverse, the infinite one, the one that exists outside Rick's grief architecture, the one where Rick is not guaranteed to be on top. Evil Morty steps through it, and the show ends the season with a shot of him disappearing into something the audience has never seen and cannot imagine, because the entire show up to that point has been set inside a box Rick built. After the curve is destroyed, the show restores it. This happens in season 6 through a somewhat indirect series of events, and the restoration is not treated as a major dramatic moment. It is almost a background fact. The curve is broken, and then it is fixed, and the show continues. This choice frustrated some viewers who had expected the destruction
destruction of the curve to open up a genuinely different version of the show. But the restoration is also honest about something. Rick's psychological need for control does not go away because the physical structure that expressed it got destroyed. He rebuilt it, or allowed it to be rebuilt, because the thing the curve was protecting him from, the feeling of genuine powerlessness, of being the person in the garage watching the bomb fall, is still there. The wall came down and the fear was still present, so the wall went back up. This is how trauma works. You can knock down the structure someone built around their pain. The pain remains. The structure goes back up. Rick Sanchez built a wall around infinity because he could not build a wall around the afternoon in the garage when everything ended. The curve is the closest thing to that wall that unlimited intelligence and interdimensional technology could produce. It is enormous, and it is intricate, and it covers every accessible dimension in the multiverse. It is also, at its core, a man who is still afraid of a bomb he couldn't stop.
The curve tells you more about who Rick Sanchez actually is than almost anything else in the show. Not because it shows you his power, though the scale of it is genuinely staggering, but because it shows you what he needed his power for. It wasn't freedom, it wasn't exploration, it was control. Specifically, the kind of control that means never again standing in a driveway watching something terrible happen and being unable to stop it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And yet, for all the architecture Rick built to prevent that feeling, there is one version of it he kept anyway, on purpose, deliberately, in a house in Dimension C-137, where an AI that sounded like Diane called to him from the other room. He couldn't build the curve around the grief itself. He could only build it around the conditions that produced it, which is why, when Rick Prime finally died in Season 7, the victory felt hollow. The wall was still standing, but the reason he built it was gone. What a man does when the wound that made him is avenged but not healed is one of the most complicated questions the show has ever raised. And it leads directly to the question of who Rick Prime actually was, and why the show needed him to be the worst possible version of what Rick could have become. Section 6. Rick Prime and the Mirror Rick. Every story about a person trying to understand themselves eventually produces a mirror, something or someone that reflects back what they could have been, what they chose not to be, or what they are becoming without realizing it. For Rick Sanchez, that mirror has a name, Rick Prime. And unlike most mirrors in most stories, this one did not show up as a metaphor or a dream sequence or a philosophical thought experiment. He showed up in a garage in Dimension C-137, offered portal technology to a man who was happy with his life, and when that man said no, he came back and killed his family. Rick Prime is the single most important character in understanding Rick C-137. Not because of what Prime did, though what he did is the engine that drives the entire show, but because of what Prime is. He is what Rick C-137 could have become. He is the version of Rick Sanchez who said yes to the portal gun and no to everything else. He is the answer to the question of what happens when a genius with unlimited capability decides that intelligence is the only thing worth being. The confirmed canon of Rick Prime is mostly delivered across Season 5 and Season 7. Before those seasons, he was known only through implication. The Rick responsible for Diane's death, the shadow behind C-137's entire arc, the reason the show exists. When the show finally brought him forward fully, what it revealed was not a villain with a plan or an ideology or even a coherent motivation. Rick Prime is disturbing precisely because of what he lacks. He is not cruel in the way that a person who feels things and chooses cruelty is cruel. He killed Diane and Beth because C-137 annoyed him by saying no. Not because he wanted something from it, not because he had a reason, because he was capable of it, and because being told no by another version of himself was an irritation he chose to eliminate. This is the darkest version of what unlimited intelligence and zero emotional attachment produces. Rick Prime did not become a monster because of trauma. He became a monster because he never had the trauma that makes most people human. He accepted the portal gun and walked away from his family without grief, without looking back, without the thing that broke C-137, and rebuilt him into someone who, underneath all the damage, still cares enormously. Prime never had the damage. He never had the grief. He never had anything to lose, because he chose, at the moment of choice, to have nothing to lose. And a person who has chosen to have nothing to lose is not free. They are empty. Rick Prime is the show's portrait of what emptiness looks like when it has a genius-level mind and access to infinite dimensions. The episode Unmortrican in Season 7 is where C-137 finally finds him, fights him, and kills him. The episode is built around this confrontation, and what it delivers is deliberately viscerally uncomfortable. Prime, when faced with C-137's decades of rage and grief and hunting, is not frightened. He is not dramatic. He is barely interested. He treats the confrontation as an inconvenience, as something mildly amusing, as a problem to be solved, rather than a reckoning to be faced. He does not feel the weight of what he did to Diane and Beth. He does not feel it because he is constitutionally incapable of feeling it. He made himself that way. Or he was always that way, and the portal gun just gave him the room to express it across infinite dimensions instead of just one. There is a moment in their confrontation where C-137's hatred, the thing that has powered him for decades, the thing that kept him moving through every loss and every hollow year of hunting, meets Prime's complete indifference, and the collision is sickening in a very specific way. C-137 needed Prime to be a worthy opponent. He needed him to feel something, to be afraid, to understand what he took. The decades of hunting were fueled in part by the belief that somewhere, at the end of them, was a moment of genuine reckoning, a moment where the person responsible for destroying C-137's life would have to sit with what they did. That moment does not come. Prime does not sit with anything. He is killed, and the reckoning dies with him, unfelt by the person who most needed to feel it. This is one of the most honest things Rick and Morty has ever done, and it is extremely uncomfortable. Revenge stories, as a structure, usually deliver something. The bad person suffers. The good person, or the damaged person seeking justice, gets something back. The equation balances. C-137's story refuses this. Prime is killed, and C-137 is left with nothing resolved, because the thing he actually needed from the confrontation, to be seen, to have his loss acknowledged by the person who caused it, was never going to be available from someone like Prime. You cannot get acknowledgement from someone who is not capable of it. C-137 spent decades hunting something that could never give him what he needed from it. After Prime dies, C-137 falls apart. This is confirmed in Season 7. He falls back into drinking heavily. He loses direction. The one engine that had kept him moving, revenge, the hunt, the forward momentum of having a purpose, even if it was a dark one, is gone. He does not feel victorious. He does not feel healed. He feels, as the show makes clear through his behavior in the episodes following Unmortarkin, like a man who has completed the only task he gave himself and found that completing it did not fill the hole it was supposed to fill. Diane is still dead. Beth, his Beth, the one who died in the bombing, is still dead. Prime being dead does not change either of those facts. It was never going to. C-137 knew this, probably, somewhere underneath the rage, but knowing something intellectually and feeling it are different things, and grief is not rational. Morty is what pulls him back. This is also confirmed in the show. After Prime's death leaves C-137 adrift, it is Morty who gives him a reason to keep going. Not through a speech or a dramatic intervention, but simply by being there, by continuing to be the person who needs Rick and who Rick needs, by representing the life that C-137 built out of the rubble of the original one. The show has always been clear that the Rick-Morty relationship is complicated and often harmful, but it has also always been clear that for C-137, Morty is the thing that anchors him to the world. When the hunt ended and there was nothing left to run toward, Morty was still there. That was enough to keep C-137 moving. Now go back to the beginning of the story, back to the garage in C-137, where two Ricks met and one of them said no. The choice C-137 made to stay home, to turn down the portal gun, to choose his family over the infinite multiverse, is the choice that defines everything. It is the choice that got Diane and Beth killed, because Prime could not accept being told no by a version of himself. But it is also the choice that made C-137 who he is. The version of Rick who said no to infinite power because he wanted to stay home with his wife is the same version of Rick who, decades later, cannot stop caring about his family, no matter how many walls he builds. The capacity for that kind of love, the kind that says no to everything else, is the thing that Prime destroyed when he dropped that bomb. It is also the thing he could not destroy, because it was already inside C-137, already part of who he was, and grief cannot unmake the thing that caused it. Prime said yes to the portal gun. He walked away from his family, a different family, in a different dimension, but his family, without looking back. His dimension is called the Prime Dimension, and the show confirms that he abandoned his Beth and his Diane there, leaving them without a husband or a father, exactly the way C-137's Beth was abandoned by Prime in the dimension C-137 eventually moved into. Prime did not just murder C-137's family, he abandoned his own. He did the same thing to the Diane and Beth of his original dimension that he did to C-137's, made them irrelevant, chose the portal gun and the infinite multiverse over them, and never came back. The difference is that C-137's family died violently. Prime's family simply never saw him again. This parallel is the show's clearest statement about what separates C-137 from Prime and what connects them. They are the same same person at the point of origin. Same genetics, same intelligence, same starting position. The divergence is a single decision, yes or no, the portal gun or the family. C-137 chose the family and had it taken from him. Prime chose the portal gun and gave his family up voluntarily. Both Ricks ended up without their families, but C-137 ended up broken by the loss, and Prime ended up with nothing to be broken by, because he had never allowed himself to have anything in the first place. The show uses this parallel to ask something it never quite states directly, but that is visible in almost every scene featuring Prime. Is it better to love something and lose it, or to never allow yourself to love it at all? Prime's answer, by his behavior, is clearly the second option. He would rather have nothing to lose. C-137's entire life after the bombing is the argument against that answer. He is wrecked by losing Diane. He is still wrecked decades later. The alcohol, the walls, the central finite curve, the decades of hunting, all of it is the cost of having loved something and lost it. And yet the show consistently positions C-137, for all his damage, as more fully human than Prime, more real, more present, more worth following. Because the damage is evidence of something Prime threw away. The wound proves the love was real. Prime has no wounds because he made sure he would have nothing to be wounded by. There is also the Omega device, which Prime used to kill every version of Diane across the entire multiverse. This is confirmed in Season 7. After murdering C-137's Diane, Prime eventually used a weapon designed specifically to eliminate a person across every dimension simultaneously, and he used it on Diane. Every Diane, in every reality, is dead because of this. Prime used an infinite-scale weapon on a woman, on every version of a woman, because Ricks, who had lost their Dianes, kept hunting him for revenge. He killed Diane everywhere to stop Ricks from having a reason to come after him. The logic is purely practical, which is precisely the point. This is what a genius with no emotional attachment does when faced with an inconvenience. He eliminates it at the largest possible scale and moves on. C-137 did not know this when he killed Prime. He found out later through the events of Season 7. The Omega device means that his final hope, the quiet, probably unacknowledged hope that somewhere in the multiverse there was a Diane who was still alive, a version of his wife in some dimension he hadn't reached yet, was gone. There is no version of the multiverse where Diane exists. Prime made sure of it. The completeness of this loss, and the fact that C-137 only fully understood it after his revenge was already spent, is one of the quieter cruelties the show delivers in its later seasons. What Rick Prime ultimately represents, in the architecture of the whole show, is the road not taken made flesh and made terrible. C-137 looks at Prime and sees what he would have become if the bombing had never happened. Not exactly, because C-137 had already made the choice that Prime could not make, the choice to stay, but close enough to be deeply uncomfortable. He also sees what he could still become. A genius with unlimited capability and zero emotional tethering is not a stable state. It is a direction of travel. C-137 has been moving towards something like Prime in his worst moments. The cruelty, the manipulation, the dismissal of the people around him as less important than his own purposes. The show knows this. Rick knows this, which is part of why the hunt for Prime was so consuming. You chase the mirror for a long time, because looking at it is the only way to know how close you are to becoming it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Prime is dead now. The mirror is gone. What C-137 does with the version of himself that remains, the one who loved Diane, who chose the family, who built walls instead of abandoning everyone, who almost died on a garage floor and woke up the next morning and kept going, is the question the show has been building towards since the pilot. And it connects directly to the episode that made the most people talk about Rick Sanchez. Not because of the mythology or the multiverse or the revenge arc, but because of a man who turned himself into a pickle to avoid sitting in a room and being honest about how he feels. Section 7. Pickle Rick is not a power fantasy. In the summer of 2017, a man turning himself into a pickle became one of the most talked about moments in the history of adult animation. Pickle Rick aired as the third episode of Season 3, and within days of its broadcast, the phrase, "I'm Pickle Rick," had spread across the internet in a way that very few moments from any television show manage. It appeared on t-shirts, it appeared in comment sections on videos that had nothing to do with Rick and Morty, it was referenced in news articles, late-night shows, and conversations between people who had never seen a single episode of the series. The meme version of Pickle Rick is a celebration. It is a man doing something ridiculous and being completely delighted about it. It is chaos for its own sake, confidence without apology, the ultimate expression of doing whatever you want because you can. The episode is about something almost exactly opposite to that. Pickle Rick is one of the most carefully constructed pieces of television Rick and Morty has ever produced.
produced. And the thing it is constructing, the argument it is making, scene by scene, across his 22-minute runtime, is a portrait of a man so afraid of being honest about how he feels that he would rather nearly die in a sewer than sit in a room with a therapist for an hour. The meme captured the surface. The surface was always designed to hide what was underneath. That design was intentional, and it works so well that a significant portion of the people who watched the episode initially responded to it as a celebration of the very thing it was diagnosing. The setup is simple. The Smith family, Beth, Morty, and Summer, has a therapy appointment with a woman named Dr. Wong. Rick, who does not want to attend, transforms himself into a pickle using his own technology right before the session begins, removing his ability to get up and travel anywhere. He then places the syringe that would turn him back into a human somewhere out of reach, so that Beth would have to cancel the appointment to reverse the transformation. He announces what he has done to Morty with the specific energy of a man who is extremely pleased with his own cleverness. He turned himself into a pickle. He cannot attend therapy. Problem solved. Beth takes the syringe, loads the family into the car, and goes to therapy without him. Rick then spends the rest of the episode engineering his own survival as a pickle in conditions that would kill almost any other being. He falls into the sewer. He is attacked by rats and cockroaches. He kills them using the first available bug with a method that involves controlling its central nervous system through the exposed stub of his spine, and then builds a mobile suit out of their parts. Insect legs for locomotion, rat skulls for armor, improvised weapons made from whatever the sewer provides. He gets out of the sewer, he ends up inside a government building, a foreign embassy full of armed guards, and a sophisticated security operation. He fights his way through the entire building. He kills most of the people in it. He builds a laser out of office supplies. He wins. The action sequence is extraordinary television. It is funny and inventive and relentless. And the animation is some of the best the show has produced. And it is also, in the context of everything else happening in the episode, a complete and almost unbearable illustration of how far Rick will go to avoid a single honest conversation. Think about the math of what he chose. He transformed himself into a vegetable. He fell into a sewer. He nearly died multiple times in conditions that would be lethal to essentially any other creature. He built a weapon system out of dead rats. He fought through an entire building of armed professionals and killed a substantial number of them. He did all of this, sustained extremely dangerous, extraordinarily complex work, rather than sit in Dr. Wong's office for an hour and talk about why his family is struggling. The episode does not let the audience simply enjoy the action sequence without confronting this. It cuts constantly between the pickle adventure and the therapy session, where Beth, Morty, and Summer are sitting with Dr. Wong and actually doing the difficult, uncomfortable work that Rick chose a near-death experience to avoid. The therapy scenes are awkward and painful in the way therapy often is. Beth talks about her relationship with Rick in ways that are clearly true and clearly difficult for her to say out loud. The kids engage with the process in their different ways. The session is not presented as an easy or pleasant thing. It is presented as real work that requires the people doing it to be vulnerable and uncomfortable and present. The structural contrast is the episode's argument. The pickle adventure is exciting and the therapy is uncomfortable. The editing puts these two things next to each other for 20 minutes and asks the audience to sit with the fact that the exciting thing is avoidance and the uncomfortable thing is growth. Most television, and most people, would rather watch the pickle adventure. The episode knows this. It is designed to give you the pickle adventure in full so that you feel the pull of it, so that you understand from the inside why Rick made the choice he made. And then it gives you Dr. Wong. Dr. Wong is voiced by Susan Sarandon, and she is, in the context of the episode and in the broader context of the whole show, the most clear-sighted person Rick has ever been in a room with. When Rick finally arrives at the therapy session, having survived everything the sewer and the embassy threw at him, carrying the pickle transformation as a kind of trophy of his own ingenuity, Dr. Wong does not congratulate him. She does not react to the pickle story the way Rick's adventures usually make people react. She listens to it. And then she says something that Rick has no answer to. She tells him that she has no doubt he is the most capable person she has ever encountered. She says she believes completely that he could survive an apocalypse and likely be the last man standing. She also says that he would be the loneliest. She tells him that his intelligence and his capability are not the problem. The problem is that he uses them to avoid accountability. He is not turning himself into a pickle because it is interesting. He is doing it because therapy would require him to be responsible for his part in what his family is going through. And responsibility
ability is something he will do almost anything to escape. Then she says something that lands harder the more you sit with it. She says that the fact that he is here, the fact that he ended up in her office after all of that, suggests that some part of him knows that what he is running from is worth running toward. He transformed himself into a pickle and fell into a sewer and fought through a building and still ended up in the one place he was trying to avoid. He went to extraordinary lengths to escape therapy and arrived at therapy anyway. His own survival instinct, the intelligence and resourcefulness that drove the entire action sequence, led him back to the room he was trying to leave. Rick has no comeback. This is the most significant moment in the scene, and possibly in the broader arc of Rick's character up to this point. Rick Sanchez, the smartest being in the universe, the man who has talked his way out of galaxy-scale problems and manipulated entire civilizations and built a device to trap himself in infinite realities where he is always the most capable person in the room, sits in Dr. Wong's office and has nothing to say. She is right about him. He knows she is right about him. The intelligence he uses to outmaneuver everything has nothing to offer against someone who is simply, clearly, accurately describing what he is doing and why. The ending of the episode makes this worse and more honest. Rick and Beth walk out of the session together. Summer and Morty, who engage with the therapy genuinely, tell Beth they want to keep going. They found something useful in it. Beth and Rick, looking at each other, make non-verbal plans to go get a drink instead. The generational pattern closes around itself. The people who were most harmed by Rick's avoidance, the kids, are the ones willing to do the work. The adults who learned avoidance as a way of life are already moving toward the exit. Rick does not have a breakthrough. He does not leave therapy changed. He leaves therapy having heard the truth from someone who had no reason to be kind about it, and he goes to get a drink. This is a more honest ending than almost any other version of this story would give you. The episode does not redeem Rick through the experience of being seen accurately. It shows you what happens when someone who has spent their whole life running is correctly identified by someone they cannot outmaneuver. And the answer is that they keep running, because knowing you are running and stopping are two completely different things. Now consider what the meme did to all of this. I'm Pickle Rick became a celebration of exactly what the episode was criticizing. The transformation, which is Rick's most elaborate act of emotional avoidance in the entire series, became cultural shorthand for chaotic, unbothered confidence. The image of Rick as a pickle, triumphant and ridiculous, spread everywhere as an expression of not caring what anyone thinks and doing whatever you want regardless of consequences. The survival sequence, which the episode frames as an indictment, as evidence of how much energy Rick burns to avoid 1 hour of honesty, became the iconic part. The therapy scene, which is the episode's actual payload, became secondary. Dr. Wong's speech, which is the most precise description of Rick's psychology the show ever produces, is remembered by far fewer people than the image of a pickle with a rat skull attached to it. The show was aware that this might happen. Dan Harmon and the writers knew they were making an episode whose surface was extremely memeable and whose actual content was a clinical examination of avoidance behavior and its costs. They built it that way deliberately. The surface being appealing was part of the point, because Rick's surface is always appealing. That is how he operates. The chaos and the competence and the ridiculous confidence are real, and they are also the mechanism by which he keeps everyone from looking at what is underneath them. The audience doing to Pickle Rick exactly what Rick's family does to Rick, laughing at the spectacle, missing the cry underneath it, is the episode working exactly as designed. What the episode confirms about Rick, in terms of hard canon, is significant. Dr. Wong's observation that Rick uses his intelligence to avoid accountability is not a theory or a reading. It is stated directly in the episode by a character whose entire professional function is to say true things about people. Rick does not contradict her. He sits there and takes it, which is itself confirmation. The smartest being in the universe does not dispute the diagnosis. He accepts it silently and then immediately does the thing the diagnosis describes. He avoids the accountability by going to get a drink instead of continuing therapy. The pickle transformation is also confirmation of something that runs through the whole show. Rick's solutions to problems are almost always more complex and more costly than the problems themselves. He could have simply not gone to therapy. He could have made an excuse, claimed a prior commitment, stayed in the garage. Instead, he transformed himself into a vegetable and engineered an elaborate sequence of events to make the transformation someone else's problem to fix. The complexity is the point. A simple avoidance would leave room for someone to push back, to say the excuse is weak, to make him feel the pressure of what he is avoiding. An elaborate, technically brilliant, genuinely impressive avoidance forecloses that pushback. You cannot argue with a man who has turned himself into a pickle. You can only deal with the fact of it. This is Rick's emotional intelligence applied to emotional avoidance. He is not bad at understanding feelings. He is extraordinary
extraordinarily good at it, which is exactly why he is so good at not having to deal with them. He knows what therapy would require. He knows what being in that room would mean. He has thought about it clearly enough to understand precisely how to construct an exit that no one can argue with. The intelligence that could help him heal is the intelligence he uses to make healing impossible. Dr. Wong sees all of this. She says all of this. Rick hears all of it. And then he goes to the bar. The meme says, "I'm Pickle Rick," like it is a victory. The episode says it like it is a wound. Both things are technically true, which is why the episode works as well as it does, and why the meme spread as far as it did. Rick Sanchez is genuinely impressive and genuinely damaged in exactly the same moment, through exactly the same behavior, using exactly the same intelligence. You can watch the Pickle adventure as a power fantasy and you will be entertained. You can watch it as a portrait of avoidance and you will be devastated. The show built it to do both at once, because that is how Rick operates. Always impressive enough that the damage underneath stays hidden until someone like Dr. Wong is willing to say it out loud. __quote _6 ___. What Pickle Rick sets up, without fully resolving, is a question about whether being seen accurately is enough to produce change. Dr. Wong sees Rick completely. Rick knows he has been seen. He walks out of the office and immediately demonstrates that being seen and being changed are not the same thing. The section of the show that takes this question furthest, that examines most directly whether Rick is capable of the kind of change that does not get undone at the exit to the therapist's office, involves the person who has been on the receiving end of his avoidance longer and more consistently than anyone else, which is exactly what the next section is about. Section 8. Rick and Morty's relationship is abusive, and the show knows it. There is a moment in Season 5 where Rick sits Morty down and says something the show has been building toward for 4 full seasons. He tells Morty that he has been a bad partner because he never made him a true partner. He says it plainly, without a joke attached to it, without an immediate deflection or a sarcastic follow-up designed to take the sincerity back. He says it and he means it, and the show lets it sit there. This moment is important not because it resolves anything. It doesn't, not really, not in any permanent way, but because it confirms something the show has been quietly demonstrating since the pilot. The relationship between Rick and Morty is not simply a rough but loving bond between a grandfather and his grandson. It is a relationship with a real and specific power imbalance, a pattern of control and manipulation that has caused measurable damage to Morty across every season, and a dynamic that the show has been examining with increasing honesty as it has matured. Rick's admission in Season 5 is not the show discovering this for the first time. It is the show finally letting one of its characters say out loud what the audience has been watching for years. Start at the beginning. The pilot episode establishes the relationship in terms that seem comedic on first viewing and become darker as the series continues. Rick arrives back in Morty's life after a long absence, moves into the garage, and immediately begins pulling Morty out of school to take him on adventures. His stated reason, repeated several times in early episodes, is that Morty's brainwave pattern cancels out his own, making him harder to detect by enemies. Morty is useful. His neurological profile serves a practical function. Rick needs him the way a person needs a tool that works. The warmth between them in the early episodes is real. The show is not pretending the affection is manufactured, but it exists alongside a foundational transaction in which Morty's value is primarily instrumental. The full extent of this transaction is not revealed until Rick Murray Jack in Season 5, which confirms what the brainwave explanation was actually covering. The Ricks of the central finite curve, including C137, engineered Beth and Jerry's relationship across countless dimensions specifically to produce Mortys. Not this Morty, Mortys as a category. The brainwave cancellation is real, and Ricks across the multiverse need Mortys to hide from enemies and the Galactic Federation. So the Citadel arranged for Mortys to be manufactured in bulk across infinite dimensions by manipulating the conditions that would cause Beth and Jerry to meet, fall in love, and have children. Rick C137 was part of the group that designed this system. The boy he takes on adventures, the person he calls his grandson and his partner, exists in his life partly as the result of a system Rick helped build to generate an endless supply of people with the right brainwave pattern. This is not presented in the show as something that negates the genuine bond between Rick and Morty. The show is too honest for that simple a reading. But it is presented as something that complicates it in ways that cannot be ignored. Rick loves Morty. This is demonstrated repeatedly, and the love is real. Rick also entered this family with an awareness that Morty's existence was, at least in part, engineered. He moved into the garage of a Beth who was not technically his daughter, in a dimension that was not technically
technically his, and built a relationship with a Morty who was not technically his grandson, while knowing that the entire Smith family lineage across the multiverse had been shaped to produce people like Morty. The love grew out of a transaction. That does not make the love false, but it makes the transaction worth looking at. The Vat of Acid episode in Season 4 is the clearest single-episode demonstration of what the relationship looks like at its worst. The setup is that Rick has a fake vat of acid he uses as an escape plan during a deal with alien gangsters. If things go wrong, he and Morty jump in the vat and the gangsters assume they are dead. Morty criticizes the plan as stupid and overly elaborate. Rick, rather than engaging with the criticism, engineers an elaborate revenge. He gives Morty a device he claims is a save point, something that would let Morty reset back to any moment he chose, like a video game. Morty uses it to live without consequences, makes a series of increasingly significant choices, and eventually falls into a relationship with a girl he genuinely cares about. Then the device resets everything to the save point, erasing the relationship, and the girl has no memory of him. The device was never a save point. Rick explains what it actually was: a device that killed alternate dimension versions of Morty and replaced the current Morty with whichever alternate had lived the life closest to what Morty wanted. Every reset was a death. Every saved game was a different Morty's corpse. Rick built something that killed versions of his grandson on a loop to win an argument about whether his fake vat of acid was a good idea, and then explained it to Morty in detail so that Morty would understand exactly what had been done to him. The episode does not frame this as dark comedy with a warm resolution. It frames it as Rick being deliberately, specifically cruel to someone who questioned him. The relationship between Rick and Morty has always included moments where Rick punishes Morty for stepping out of line, for disagreeing, for questioning, for failing to perform the role of admiring sidekick with sufficient enthusiasm. The Vat of Acid episode is that pattern taken to its logical endpoint. Rick did not just dismiss Morty's criticism. He built a machine designed to make Morty feel the loss of something real, and then made sure Morty understood that the loss was Rick's doing, so that the lesson would be clear. Do not question me. Do not challenge what I build. The cost of doing so is higher than you can afford. This is not the behavior of a bad partner who doesn't realize he is being harmful. It is the behavior of someone who understands exactly what he is doing and chooses to do it anyway. Rick is not unconscious of the dynamic. He is aware of it, capable of articulating it when pushed, and largely unwilling to change it until external pressure becomes impossible to ignore. The pressure that finally becomes impossible to ignore arrives in Season 5 through the Crows. Rick and Morty fall out after Morty tampers with Rick's portal gun fluid, something Morty does and then lies about because he is afraid of Rick's response. Rick, furious, replaces Morty with two crows he trains to serve as adventure partners. He does this partly as an exaggerated joke and partly to make a point about Morty's replaceability. What happens instead is that the crows outperform Morty in almost every measurable way. They are useful, capable, loyal without being fearful, and they engage with Rick as genuine partners rather than as a subordinate trying to manage an authority figure's moods. The crows accidentally show Rick something he has been avoiding seeing. Morty is not afraid of being replaced. Morty is afraid of Rick. There is a difference between a relationship built on genuine partnership and a relationship built on one person managing their fear of the other person's reactions. The crows are not afraid of Rick. They work with him because they choose to. Morty, across 4 seasons of adventures, has been operating inside a relationship where the consequences of failure or disagreement were high enough to make fear a permanent background condition. Rick sees this. His admission to Morty in the episode Forgetting Sarek Mortshaw that he has been a bad partner because he never made Morty a true partner comes directly from the Crow experience. The Crows showed him, in practical and unavoidable terms, what a partnership without fear looks like. The contrast was clear enough that even Rick, who has spent the entire show not looking at what he does to Morty, could not avoid it. But admissions and change are different things. The admission happens. Then the season ends with the events of Rick Mirai Jack, in which the whole architecture of the central finite curve and the Morty manufacturing system is revealed to Morty. He learns that the family he belongs to, the life he is living, the grandfather he has been protecting and following and forgiving for 5 seasons, exists within a structure that was partly designed to produce people like him for use. He learns this, and he still chooses to help Rick escape the collapsing citadel. He pushes the rocket boosters to get them out of the black hole evil Morty creates, choosing C-137 over evil Morty's offer of something like freedom. He makes this choice knowing what he now knows. This choice is not simple. The show does not present it as simple. Morty Morty choosing to stay with Rick after learning the full truth is not just loyalty or love, though it is those things too. It is also the choice of someone who has been in a relationship long enough and deeply enough that leaving it is not a clean option, even when you have every reason to leave. The dynamic between them has shaped Morty across his entire adolescence. Rick is not just a person in Morty's life. He is a primary architect of who Morty has become, of the confidence Morty has developed, the darkness he has absorbed, the capability he has built, and the damage he carries. You cannot simply walk away from someone who has been that formative, even when you understand clearly what the relationship has cost you. The show tracks the cost honestly across all 7 seasons. Morty starts the series as a nervous, sweet, mostly passive kid who goes along with Rick's adventures because he has no framework yet for saying no effectively. By season 4, he shoots Rick in the head during an argument. Not in the leg, not in the arm, in the head. In a moment of genuine rage and exhaustion, the boy who could barely speak up in season 1 shoots his grandfather directly in the face. The show presents this as a character beat, not just a gag. Morty has absorbed enough of Rick's willingness to escalate that he is capable of this. He has also absorbed enough of Rick's damage that his threshold for what is acceptable has shifted dramatically from where it started. Season 6 has Rick compare Morty to a suicide bomber in terms of his recklessness during an adventure. The comparison is harsh and delivered coldly, but the show has set up enough context that the comparison lands as more than just Rick being cruel. Morty has become more reckless across the seasons. He has become more willing to take risks, more comfortable with violence, more capable of doing things that the season 1 version of him would not have been able to do. Rick is partly responsible for this. The adventures that have shaped Morty have also changed him in ways that are not entirely healthy. Rick's influence has made Morty more capable and more damaged in proportions that are impossible to fully separate. The manipulation of Beth and Jerry's relationship, revealed in Rick Mirai Jack, casts the entire Smith family dynamic in a different light. Jerry is a man who has always been presented as a failure, someone who can't hold a job, who is constantly dismissed by Rick, who represents everything Rick finds contemptible about ordinary human life. The revelation that Jerry and Beth were manipulated into meeting and having children means that Jerry is not simply a man who made poor choices. He is a man whose entire life path was engineered by forces he had no knowledge of to produce a child who would be useful to an old man with a portal gun. Rick's contempt for Jerry has always been one of the show's running jokes. After Rick Mirai Jack, it becomes something more uncomfortable. The contempt of a man toward a person whose life he helped arrange, who is living inside the arrangement without knowing it. The relationship between Rick and Morty is, across all of this, both genuinely loving and genuinely harmful. The show does not resolve this into one or the other. Rick loves Morty in a way that is demonstrated repeatedly and consistently across the whole series. He has risked his life for Morty. He has made sacrifices for Morty. In season 1's A Wrinkle in Time, facing a situation where one of them would have to stay in a fractured timeline and likely not survive, Rick chooses to be the one to stay and sends Morty to safety. His last words in that moment, before he thinks he is going to die, are for Morty to be better than him. Not to be safe, not to be okay, to be better than Rick. The standard Rick holds Morty to, even in extremity, is not survival. It is growth beyond what Rick himself has managed. This is the full picture of the relationship. A man who helped engineer the conditions for his grandson's existence, who uses him as a brainwave shield, who punishes him for questioning, who admits he has never made him a true partner, who, in the same breath, would die for him and does not want him to become what Rick has become. The love is real. The harm is real. Both exist simultaneously, and neither cancels the other out. What the show understands, and what it has been demonstrating with increasing clarity across 7 seasons, is that people who love each other can still damage each other in serious ways. That the harm Rick does to Morty does not happen despite the love, but often through it, through the possessiveness, the need to be needed, the unwillingness to make Morty a true partner because a true partner might leave. Rick holds Morty close in ways that sometimes look like protection and sometimes look like control. And the line between those two things is not always easy to find. Quote 7. The admission in season 5 is the show marking that line as clearly as it has ever marked it. Rick saying he was a bad partner because he never made Morty a true partner is not the conclusion of the relationship story. It is the point where the show acknowledges, through Rick's own words, what it has been building for 5 seasons. Whether acknowledgement leads to change, and what change looks like for a man whose entire psychological architecture is built around control, is still being worked out. But the question
question of why Rick chose to control and never to share, why he chose to keep Morty dependent rather than capable, connects directly to a question the show spent 3 seasons hiding in plain sight and finally answered in one of its most quietly devastating episodes. Why did Rick never just go to a dimension where Diane was still alive? The answer is more complicated than it looks, and it tells you everything about what Rick is actually holding on to. Section 9.
Why Rick never went to a dimension where Diane was alive. The multiverse in Rick and Morty is infinite. This is not a figure of speech or an exaggeration for dramatic effect. The show establishes it as a literal fact of the universe it takes place in. Infinite dimensions. Infinite versions of every possible reality. Infinite versions of every person who has ever existed. Somewhere in that infinity, in some dimension the portal gun could theoretically reach, there is a version of Diane Sanchez who did not die in a bombing on an ordinary afternoon. There is a version of Rick's house that did not get destroyed. A version of young Beth who grew up with both parents.
Somewhere in the infinite multiverse, the worst day of Rick C-137's life did not happen. Rick has a portal gun. He has had one for decades. He can travel between dimensions. He is, by every measure the show provides, the most capable being in the accessible multiverse. He could, in theory, find a dimension where Diane is alive and go there. He has never done this. In 7 seasons of television, across hundreds of adventures that take him to alien planets and parallel realities and dimensions that operate on completely different physical laws than our own, Rick Sanchez has never once traveled to a dimension where his wife is alive and stayed there. The show eventually addresses this directly, and the answer it provides is not a single clean explanation, but a collection of overlapping truths that together paint one of the most honest portraits of grief in animated television. The first and most straightforward reason is the one the show confirms through the events of Season 5 and Season 7. Rick Prime used the Omega device to kill Diane in every dimension simultaneously. This is confirmed canon. After murdering C-137's Diane, Prime eventually used a weapon specifically designed to eliminate a person across all of their infinite versions at once, and he used it on Diane. Every Diane, in every reality, across the entire multiverse, is dead. There is no dimension where Diane Sanchez is alive. Rick Prime made certain of this, not for any grand ideological reason, but because Ricks who lost their Dianes kept hunting him for revenge, and eliminating the source of their grief was the most efficient way to neutralize the threat. This means that the question of why Rick never went to a dimension where Diane was alive has a literal answer, because there is no such dimension. Rick Prime closed that door across all of infinity. The option that seems obvious, just find a version of Diane who survived, was removed from the table by the same person who put Rick on the path of grief in the first place. But here is what makes this more complicated and more interesting. Rick did not know the full extent of the Omega device's reach for most of the show. For much of the series, from C-137's perspective, the question of a living Diane somewhere in the multiverse was theoretically open. He had not confirmed that every version of her was gone. He was aware that Prime had done damage across multiple dimensions. The show hints at this in various ways. But the complete picture of the Omega device was not fully established until later seasons. So the question of why he did not seek out a living Diane applies to the years before the full truth was known, when the option might have seemed available, and he still did not take it. The answers to that version of the question are less about logistics and more about psychology. The first psychological reason is the one the show makes most explicit. By the time Rick fully processed his loss and regained the capability to think clearly about what came next, he was consumed by revenge. The grief did not produce a search for comfort, it produced a hunt. C-137's response to losing Diane was not to find another version of her. It was to find the person responsible and make him pay. This is an entirely human response to an unbearable loss, and the show treats it as such. Grief channeled into purpose is easier to carry than grief on its own. The hunt gave C-137 forward momentum. It gave him something to do with the rage and the loss that was more bearable than sitting with it. Going to find a living Diane would have required sitting with it. The hunt required moving forward. This is also why Rick became an alcoholic. The alcohol and the hunt served the same function. They kept the grief in motion, kept it from settling into the specific weight of simply missing someone who was gone. A man who is drinking and hunting is a man who does not have to grieve cleanly. He is always either numbing or moving. Clean grief, the kind that would come from sitting with the loss without a task to distract from it, is the kind Rick has spent decades avoiding. Finding a living Diane would have forced exactly this. He would have been confronted with a version of the woman he lost who did not know him, who had her own life, who was not the specific Diane he married and built a life with. The grief of that encounter, of seeing her alive and knowing she was not his Diane, would have been a different and and possibly worse version of the loss. This connects to the second psychological reason, which is about what the specific Diane of C-137 represents to Rick by the time the show takes place. The show confirms this across Season 6, through the AI Rick built and through the way he talks about Diane in the rare moments he talks about her at all. By the later seasons,
Rick C-137 has transferred his consciousness multiple times. He has had multiple bodies. He has replaced parts of himself with better technology. He is described in the show as having been so thoroughly modified over the decades that the only truly original part of him that remains is his love for Diane. Not the portal gun knowledge, not the intelligence. Those exist in other Ricks. What is specific to C-137, what makes him who he is rather than any other version of Rick,
is the fact that he loved this specific woman and lost her in this specific way and has been carrying it ever since. Replacing Diane, finding another version and building a life with her would mean releasing the grief. And releasing the grief would mean losing the last thing that is authentically and only his. Every other Rick in the multiverse is also a genius. Every other Rick also built a portal gun. The intelligence and the capability are not unique to C-137. What is unique to him is the wound, the specific shape of what he lost and what he has been carrying because of it. If he went to a dimension with a living Diane and allowed himself to move on, he would be giving up the one thing that differentiates him from every other version of himself. He would be, in a very real sense, no longer Rick C-137. He would just be another Rick. The show makes this explicit through a line in Season 6. Rick is described as being so modified by that point that his love for Diane is the only original thing left. Letting go of that would mean losing what little of his original self remains. For a man who has replaced almost everything else about himself, body, memories in various configurations, relationships, the grief is the last piece of continuity. It is the thread that connects the Rick standing in the garage in the later seasons to the young man who looked through a window at his wife and daughter and said no to the infinite multiverse because he had everything he needed right there. Cutting that thread would not be healing. It would be the last form of abandonment, abandoning the self that loved her. The Diane AI that Rick built in his old house in Dimension C-137 makes this concrete. Rick constructed a machine that sounds like his dead wife calling to him from the other room. The AI does not comfort him. The show makes clear that it is specifically designed to haunt him, to remind him of his failure to save her, to call to him with something that sounds like her voice from a house that used to be their home. He built a technological version of his own guilt and installed it in the place where the worst thing happened. This is not the behavior of a man who wants to move on. This is the behavior of a man who has decided that the pain of remembering is preferable to the peace of forgetting, because the pain is the last form of connection he has left to something he will not let go. When Rick returned to Dimension C-137 in Season 6 after a portal fluid reset, he encountered the Diane AI again. He told it that it was time to move on. This is one of the most significant moments in the show's later seasons, and it is easy to underestimate. Rick telling the AI it is time to move on is Rick telling himself it is time to move on. He has not done this before. For the entire run of the show up to that point, the grief has been the engine. The hunt for Rick Prime was the grief given a task. The alcohol was the grief given a numbing agent. The central finite curve was the grief given an architectural form. Moving on would require dismantling all of these systems, or at least acknowledging that they were built around something he can no longer use as the foundation of his identity. The AI pointed out that Rick Prime had also been reset by the portal fluid error, meaning he was back in the Prime dimension, and the hunt could begin again. Rick nearly went back to it. Morty talked him out of it. The pattern almost reasserted itself completely. Grief channeled back into the hunt, forward momentum restored, the work of moving on deferred again. But something in Rick had shifted enough by Season 6 that he was willing to be talked out of it. He did not go back to the hunt. He stayed. He kept going on adventures with Morty. He remained in the life he had built, rather than returning to the one he had been building around revenge. This is the closest the show has come up to the point of the most recent seasons to Rick choosing to live in the present rather than in the wound. It is not a complete resolution. It is not a moment of healing that undoes everything that came before it. It is a small and real choice to stay rather than to chase, to be here rather than to be on the hunt. And the show treats it with appropriate smallness. It does not score it dramatically. It does not give Rick a speech. He just stays. There is also the question of what a living Diane would have meant for the specific Beth Rick
Rick is living with. When C-137 moved into the garage of Prime's Beth, the Beth who was abandoned by Prime, who grew up without her father, who has her own complex and painful relationship with the concept of Rick Sanchez as a parent, he was not simply finding a replacement for what he lost. He was walking into a relationship with a real person who had real damage from a different Rick's choices, and choosing to be her father in the way her original father refused to be. He chose this Beth not because she is a perfect substitute for his Beth, but because she needed a father, and he needed a family, and the fit was imperfect and real. Going to a dimension with a living Diane would have disrupted this. It would have placed him in a family that already had its Rick, a family that did not have the specific gap that allowed C-137 to enter. He found a family with a wound that matched the shape of what he had to offer. A Beth without a father, a Morty who needed a grandfather, a Jerry who was manageable. The Smith family of the show is not a perfect fit for C-137, and the show has never pretended it is, but it is a fit. He chose it not because it was the best possible version of a family, but because it was real and available and needed him in a way that corresponded to what he had left to give. A dimension with a living Diane would have had none of this. It would have had a Diane who did not know him, who had her own life, who may or may not have been with another version of Rick. It would have had a Beth who already had her father. There would have been no gap for C-137 to fill, no way to enter the family that matched the specific shape of his loss. The grief, in this reading, is not just something Rick carries. It is the thing that made him compatible with this particular family. The wound that Rick Prime created is the wound that allowed C-137 to find a place to belong again. This does not make what Prime did anything other than monstrous, but it means that the specific path of C-137's suffering led him to a specific place that, for all its dysfunction and difficulty, became something real. He did not go to a dimension with a living Diane, because the life he built out of losing her, imperfect and damaged and full of walls, is the life that belongs to him now, and he knows this. The man who told the Diane AI it was time to move on, who let Morty talk him back from the hunt, who keeps showing up to the garage and going on adventures with a boy who is technically not his grandson, that man knows, somewhere underneath all the performance and the nihilism and the walls, that this is the life he has. Not the life he lost, not the infinite alternatives the multiverse contains. This one, with this family, in this garage. __quote _8 __. The question of whether Rick can fully inhabit that life, whether he can be present in it rather than just passing through it on the way to something else, is the deepest question the show has been building toward across all 7 seasons. And the answer to it lives not in the mythology, or the multiverse mechanics, or the revenge arc, but in a quieter and more difficult truth about what Rick has and has not allowed himself to become. Which is exactly what the final section of this essay is about. Section 10. Rick's character arc the show pretends doesn't exist. There is a moment in Season 1 where Morty says he learned something from an adventure. Rick's response is immediate and dismissive. He asks if this is Full House. He says it with the specific contempt of a man who finds the idea of lessons and growth not just unnecessary, but actively offensive. The message is clear, and it is delivered with enough confidence that it functions as a statement of the show's identity as much as a statement of Rick's personality. This is not a show where characters learn things. This is not a show where people grow. That is for lesser television. Rick and Morty is smarter than that. This is, across 7 seasons of evidence, completely untrue. Rick Sanchez has one of the most sustained and carefully constructed character arcs in the history of adult animation. It is an arc the show officially refuses to acknowledge, that Rick himself actively mocks whenever someone points toward it, and that the writers have built anyway, quietly, consistently, through specific scenes and specific choices and specific moments of change that accumulate across the seasons into something undeniable. The arc does not announce itself. It does not give Rick speeches about how much he has grown, or episodes that end with him having learned a lesson in the traditional television sense. It builds through behavior, through what Rick does differently in Season 6 compared to Season 1, through the gap between who he is at the beginning and who he is by the later seasons, a gap that exists whether the show admits it or not. Understanding the arc requires starting at the baseline. Season 1 Rick is a specific and consistent character. He uses Morty instrumentally, as a brainwave shield, as a tag-along, as someone whose primary function is to be impressed by Rick and useful to him. He lies constantly and without apparent guilt. He manipulates the people around him with a fluency that suggests long practice. He treats other beings, including people he encounters across dimensions, as problems to be solved or obstacles to be removed. His emotional life is almost entirely hidden. The garage scene at the end of Autoerotic Assimilation is jarring partly because Season 1 and early Season 2 Rick does not give the audience much access to the the interior of the man. He is performing at full capacity, almost constantly. The performance is the primary thing. By season 4, something is shifted. The shift is not dramatic, and it is easy to miss if you are watching for a traditional arc with clear turning points and explicit acknowledgement of change. But it is there. Rick is more willing, in small moments, to let the performance drop. He is more likely to acknowledge, obliquely but genuinely, that his relationships with Morty and Beth matter to him. He is slightly less willing to be purely cruel for the sake of it. The cruelty in the vat of acid episode is still real and still significant, but it exists alongside a Rick who, in the same season, shows genuine warmth toward Morty in moments that do not immediately get undercut. The balance is shifting slowly, in the direction of someone who is very gradually becoming less defended. The progression the show documents most clearly is Rick's relationship with his own need for control. In season 1, Rick's need to be the most capable person in every situation is so total that he almost never acknowledges a limitation. He is wrong sometimes. He makes mistakes. His plans fail. But he almost never sits with the wrongness in a way that acknowledges what it means about him. By season 5, he is capable of saying directly to Morty that he has been a bad partner. Not as a manipulation, not as a setup for something else, as a genuine acknowledgement of a pattern he has recognized and is naming. This is a Rick who has developed enough self-awareness to look at his own behavior and find it insufficient. Season 1 Rick was not capable of this. The capacity itself is new. The show's writers have spoken in various interviews about the intention behind Rick's arc, specifically around season 3. Season 3 was designed to make Rick less sympathetic. The fan base had, by the end of season 2, developed a significant tendency to romanticize Rick, to treat his nihilism and his destructiveness as aspirational, to see him as the ultimate cool, detached genius who had figured out that nothing matters and was living accordingly. The season 3 writers' room made a deliberate decision to push back against this. They made Rick harder to root for. They gave him fewer redeeming moments. They made the damage he does to the people around him more visible and harder to excuse. Pickle Rick is part of this, an episode designed to make the audience feel the pull of Rick's version of events, and then have Dr. Wong dismantle it clearly enough that anyone paying attention would have to sit with what the episode is actually saying. This is a show being self-aware enough to attempt to correct its own audience's misreading through the content of its episodes. The arc Rick is on is partly a response to how viewers were receiving him. The show watched people celebrate Rick Prime-style detachment as a lifestyle, and wrote seasons that said, as clearly as animation can say anything, that this reading is wrong, and here is why. The arc is not just about Rick changing. It is about the show making its position on Rick clearer across time, using Rick's own development as the argument. The Tiny Rick episode in season 2 is an early and underappreciated moment in the arc. Rick transfers his consciousness into a younger clone body and becomes popular at Morty and Summer's high school. The young clone version of Rick, Tiny Rick, is charming and funny and free of the weight the older Rick carries. But Rick's original consciousness fights back through the songs Tiny Rick performs. The lyrics are about being trapped, about needing to get out, about a real person being buried underneath a younger, more appealing version. Summer eventually understands what is happening and helps Rick return to his original body. The episode is about Rick's relationship with his own past, with the version of himself that existed before the damage. And it establishes something important. The damage is not all of him. The original person is still there underneath it, still fighting to surface, still capable of recognizing when it is being suppressed. The Rickternal Friendshine of the Spotless Mort episode in season 5 contains one of the most significant pieces of confirmed character information in the whole show. Rick and a younger version of himself, encountered inside Bird Person's mind, have a conversation about the life C-137 is living. Younger Rick refers to the Ricks who move in with abandoned adult Beths as creeps. He says it with the contempt of someone who has not yet lost anything and cannot imagine the choices loss produces. C-137 does not respond with a defense of his choices. He listens. The moment is brief, and the show does not make a large deal of it, but it is Rick encountering his own past self's judgment and not collapsing under it. He knows what he is. He knows how it looks. He has made peace with the gap between who he thought he would be and who he became, at least enough to keep going. This capacity for self-knowledge without self-destruction is new. Season 1 Rick is defended against self-knowledge because self-knowledge is painful, and pain is the thing the walls are built to keep out. By season 5, Rick can encounter a version of himself that finds his choices contemptible and remains standing. This is not the same as being healed. It is the specific, limited progress of someone who has been carrying damage for a long time and has learned to carry it more honestly. The killing of Rick Prime in season 7 produces the arc's most important test. For the entire run of the show, the hunt for Prime has been Rick's purpose. It has been the engine that kept him moving, the
task that gave the grief a direction, the reason he got up and kept going on days when the alcohol and the emptiness were the loudest things in the room. When Prime dies in Unmortrican, the engine stops. The purpose is gone. The show does not give Rick a triumphant moment of resolution. It gives him a collapse. He falls back into drinking heavily after Prime's death. This is shown in Season 7, and it is the arc's most honest moment. The man who has been building toward revenge for decades achieves it, and the achievement reveals what was always true. The revenge was never going to fill the hole. Diane is still dead. His Beth is still dead. Prime being gone does not restore anything. The purpose that the hunt provided is exposed as a coping mechanism by its removal, the same way alcohol is exposed as a coping mechanism when the thing it was numbing is still there after the bottle is empty. Rick spent decades in motion to avoid sitting with the grief, and killing Prime forced him to stop moving. The grief was waiting. Morty is what pulls him back again. This is the most consistent element of Rick's arc across all 7 seasons. Every time Rick reaches the edge of what he can sustain on his own, Morty is there. Not as a solution or a cure, but as a reason. A specific, present, real reason to keep going that is not revenge or alcohol or the intellectual satisfaction of being the smartest being in the room. Morty is someone Rick loves, who is still alive, who is here, who needs him, and is needed by him in a way that is real and not manufactured by the Curve or the Citadel or any of the systems Rick built to protect himself. The relationship is damaged and complicated and has cost Morty enormously across 7 seasons. It is also genuinely and specifically the thing that has kept Rick C-137 alive and connected to the world more than anything else. The arc ends, as of the most recent seasons, not with resolution, but with something more honest than resolution. Rick is still an alcoholic. He is still defended, still prone to cruelty, still unwilling to be fully vulnerable with the people around him. He has not become a different person, but he has become a slightly more honest version of the same person. He told Morty he was a bad partner. He told the Diane AI it was time to move on. He let Morty talk him back from the hunt. He chose to stay in this life rather than chase another one. These are small choices, and they do not undo the decades of damage and control and manipulation. But they are different from what Season 1 Rick was capable of, and the difference is the arc. What makes Rick's arc the show pretends does not exist so specific and so carefully built is that it never arrives. Most character arcs have a destination, a moment where the change is complete, where the character has become what they were building toward, and the journey is finished. Rick's arc has no destination. It has direction. The direction is towards slightly more honesty, slightly less control, slightly more willingness to acknowledge the people around him as people rather than as resources or obstacles. He is moving, slowly and inconsistently, and with frequent reversals, towards something. The show refuses to name what he is moving toward because the show is honest enough to know that people like Rick do not arrive anywhere clean. They just keep moving. The Full House joke in Season 1 is the show telling you that Rick does not believe in character arcs. 7 seasons of television is the show demonstrating that the belief is wrong. The arc exists whether Rick acknowledges it or not, whether the show officially claims it or not, whether the audience is looking for it or watching for the pickle adventures instead. It is built into the specific decisions Rick makes differently in Season 6 than in Season 1. It is built into what he is capable of saying now that he was not capable of saying then. It is built into the small, real, unannounced choices he makes to stay in his imperfect life rather than escape it. Rick Sanchez started the show as a man performing, not caring, with such total commitment that the performance was almost indistinguishable from the real thing. And that across 10 sections and 7 seasons and one very complicated old man with a portal gun and a dead wife and a grandson he did not engineer is who Rick Sanchez actually is. Not the nihilist on the t-shirt, not the chaos god of the meme, not the smartest being in the universe performing not caring for an audience that never quite sees through the act. A man who loved something, lost it, built walls around the loss so elaborate they became the structure of reality itself, and has been, quietly, reluctantly, and without ever quite admitting it, trying to find his way back to the person who was capable of that love ever since. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.